a hedge fund manager in Weybridge with a young Muslim lad growing up in Bradford?
It would be very hard to create it if you were trying to do so from scratch. Fortunately, we're not doing it from scratch. I think you can create a shared British identity through our shared values, through our shared culture, through our history, our past, and that if you teach that and you transmit it well, it's something which anyone can feel a part of.
What aspect of that history do you emphasise?
All sorts of things. You emphasise, apart from anything else, the good and the bad. There's a feeling that at some points in our past we might only have celebrated the good things in our culture. Some people would argue in recent years we've only celebrated the bad. You've got to teach people pride and also awareness of pitfalls.
What's the pride then? What, in invention, industry, culture?
In all sorts of things. People feel pride in different. Some people feel pride in our sporting achievements. Some people feel pride in our cultural achievements. I think most people feel a bit of all of these things. I think the key thing, though, is that when people talk about a shared British identity, they tend to assume that you're excluding people somehow. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the thing here, the key thing is you have a core culture. A culture on which all sorts of variations are played, all sorts of different people pursue different things around it, but that they know what the core is that they're riffing around.
What is the core?
Is that Benjamin?
The core.
The core in this case is Britain, is British identity, is the British history, British culture, British achievements, writing, philosophy, art, architecture.
But that's multiculturalism. You just said a lot of things there.
Yes, but and they're all...
multiculturalism. I mean, Britain, by definition, is multicultural. The Celts, the Picts, the Scyllas, all the early tribes that came here came with a different culture. Even the Romans brought a culture. So the new cultures that come here now are doing what we should be doing here, is embracing them. And I would say not even tolerating them, but embracing them, because that is what is at the core of being British.
Yes.
Not sitting down. If Pickles said,
Eric Pickles?
Mr. Eric Pickles said, he wants to come up with an idea of what Britishness is. Could you imagine a group of men, probably, in suits, sitting around a table trying to define what it is that's British?
You shouldn't, as I say, it shouldn't be invented. You're not having to invent something. It's something that exists. You just have to identify.
Well, yeah, what about empire?
Empire would be part of it. You would teach the good things about empire and you teach the bad things about empire.
I think no one really...
People who come into a country tend to be on the lower socioeconomic class when they begin, and gradually over decades and then indeed centuries they come up. So yes, to an extent that's the case, and yes, to an extent it's true that there has always been immigration in this country. In the last 60 years it has been far, far larger than at any previous point in our history, and so some of these debates are now a lot more febrile than perhaps they were
can't be more
then.
Than any time in history.
I'm afraid there was. I mean, the amount of Huguenots who came to this country over a quarter of a century was the same number of people that were immigrating into Britain in a few months under New Labour. So it was a different, but it was just a different pace, and it's not necessary to pretend that away. It's also not necessary to pretend away the fact that although we have immigration, there has also always been a sense of identity in this country, which should not be ignored, and it should not be pretended away. And a lot of people now say, well, Britain has always been a country of immigrants, therefore we have no identity that's British, or no identity here. We do, people feel it, and a lot of damage is done when you tell people not only do you not have an identity, you don't have the right to an identity.
Let's go to go on, very quickly.
I was born in this country, educated in this country, and my identity is precisely not having that identity. I think the sense of Britishness is not having that identity.
That might be fine for you, but a lot of other people it might not be. A lot of other people want to feel an identity, want to feel a sense of pride in an identity. They might not want to, like you, celebrate not having an identity, but celebrate having one.
I think that is what Britishness is.
What is wrong with encouraging that pride of being British? And that was also help us to challenge extremism and all those people who are indulging in anti-national activities.
It's very dangerous.
We need to work together to combat that.
It's very un-British to think like that. That's my view.
It's very un-British to have an idea of being British.
Exactly. And when you're abroad,
that's an interesting paradox,
recognizing what that gentleman said, when you're abroad, you do have that feeling of Britishness because you somehow know what it is. But it's very nuanced, very complicated. But the idea of British people wandering around saying, I'm proud of being British, isn't very British.
A lot of people do feel that, and I don't think you should pretend that they don't have that identity or shouldn't feel it. But if I just quickly on this, another thing that is worth considering is the fact that, historically and around the world, what we have here is pretty unique. It's not completely unique, but very few other countries have this level of tolerance, decency, acceptance, and so on. And that isn't accidental. It is because there have been people in this country who have thought this through before. There is a tradition of philosophy in this country, even a religious tradition in this country, which has been accepting of people, and which we should know about if we're going to celebrate it.
But I think that if you get somebody to come up with an idea of what it is to be British, you will lose that multi-layered...
You're not coming up with it.
That will evolve. There's a difference between evolving a British identity evolving over time and celebrating multiculturalism and actively promoting that people live separately. There's a massive difference between the two.
Every time I ask somebody to tell me what is Britishness and to just put it in a sentence, they can never do it. Because the things that make me proud of being British are different, probably, to the things that make you proud of being British. I am proud of the working class struggle here.
There will be some commonalities, yeah, there will be some things in common.
Yeah.
And those
freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech, rule of law, democratic process, tolerance, acceptance, etc. These are the similarities. That's what we should focus on.
Sorry?
What freedom of speech? You ban television stations.
Let's talk about that in a minute.
And the freedom of speech, which means Benjamin Zephaniah, who happens not to be a monarchist, can upset this gentleman who happens to be, and that's fine, because that's, in this country, it is, the gentleman there is right on one thing, it is quite rare around the world to be able to be in a country and to say you don't want the head of state for it to be fine, but in this country it is fine. That is part of the tradition. There is a long tradition of anti-monarchist activity in this country. That is part of it. It's not accidental.
But this is not a value of only being British. I think I am living in this country. I obey the law of this country. My identity is with human rights. Before being British, before being Asian, before being black, we are all human. And if I come from other country and come into the UK, just say I'm British, it will give actually lots of opportunity to the racists in this country to grow up. And this is again another threat. I think it's very damaging to divide people before being British or non-British. Yes. We are human beings. We should have a law, every single people to be entitled equally before the law.
Benjamin, last word.
There has been so much discrimination, especially against
Benjamin
women.
Zephaniah, last word on this one.
You just said you obey the law. In this country, women have the right to vote. How did they get the right to vote?
Funds terrorist groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, destabilized Syria, destabilized Lebanon. To that extent, yes, it is a threat, and some people believe that if you like what they do now, you're going to love it when they're also a nuclear power. So to that extent, yes, of course. It has a long history going back 30 years now, or certainly since the revolution.
Is Israeli's assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, is that not terrorism?
I would just say that it's very unwise to assume that that's the Israelis carrying that out. Nobody knows who it is carrying out the assassination of scientists. One of the people killed the other week was one of the leaders of the Green Movement in Iran. There are a lot of things going on in the Middle East. There are a lot of countries in the Middle East that really don't want Iran to become a nuclear power. I don't think we should think it's only the Israelis.
Yeah, it's not just the Israelis.
Well, wait a minute. Harris, in a second, Benjamin.
It's not just the Israelis that have a problem with Iran becoming nuclear. It's the Saudis. It's the Bahrainis. It's the people that are diametrically opposed. It's the Wahhabis, the Salafis in terms of theology and ideology who are controlling the holy, the sacred places in Saudi Arabia, Mecca and Medina. And they're the people who have more to lose than the Israelis, and they're the ones that are really worried. And if Iran escalates in terms of nuclear weapons, what's to stop them getting them?
Afshin Rattanzi, I mean, you work for Press TV, which of course is...
I don't work for Press TV, no.
You do a programme on Press TV?
I have a production company that produces programmes for them and did work for them in Tehran. Yeah.
Right. Well, I work for the BBC and this is Menton Productions, you know, so ultimately it's what it comes down to.
Check your tax
it's funded by the Iranian state. But listen, you know, Ahmadinejad has said some extraordinary things. He said of 9/11, for example, well, he's spoken of the myth of the Holocaust. He said 9/11 was orchestrated by people in the American government. Can this man be trusted in any way, shape or form?
I think the idea of using personalities to discuss the idea that this country will go to war with another one in the next few months is, you know, as Tony Benn says, it's issues, not personalities. It's not just President Obama. It's not just President Ahmadinejad. But replying to the point over there, the U.S. National Intelligence Estimate says Iran is not a nuclear threat. Ehud Barak says so. Leo Panetta, the Defense Secretary of the United States, says so. It is only Netanyahu and and now Avic Bonino joining.
Douglas Murray.
It is always lovely to hear somebody who works for the Press TV citing the US Defense Secretary as an authority. I seem to remember only very recently you weren't doing that. Why is it you believe this Defense Secretary when he says one thing that you agree with, but you wouldn't?
I don't agree. Hang on. I'm just saying that is what the general consensus is amongst policymakers, that Iran is not a threat.
Just quickly before this lady speaks, that's not the consensus at all. That's just not the consensus. It's your opinion.
No, I'm taking the statements by
You're
Edward
taking
Barra,
very selective statements by certain people.
Well, the US National Intelligence.
We could all cite the opposite.
Well, wait a minute, Kieran Barley.
Right, the rhetoric emanating from the Iranian regime is not positive. It is sending jitters across the international community. The regime is not doing itself any favours, and what it needs to do is indulge in some voluntary confidence building to reassure us that, OK, you have nuclear facilities, they're not going to be used for weapons. And that is all it will take. No, but unless it's going, otherwise it will escalate into a war.
Terror is the backer of a terrorist proxy militia state in the heart of the Middle East with nuclear weapons. That is how the rest of the world sees this. So the way it's being portrayed, Iran being a threat, most people in the region see certainly Saudi Arabia as a threat. They're crushing their people there and in Bahrain, and David Cameron is arming them to kill their own populations. The rest of the developing world sees Britain and the United States as arming this proxy militia state called Israel, which is threatening.
But does it not seem strange that we have countries in the Middle East, we have Pakistan, my country of origin from my parents, who are struggling to feed their people, who have issues, real problems in their countries, and yet all they can think about is actually arming themselves with nuclear weapons. I think there's some real issues when a country is looking to do that.
Who would disagree with that?
Yeah.
So why are they?
Peter Jenkins, former ambassador, is Peter?
I'm afraid I'm a little bit frustrated by this discussion.
Well, let's hear from you, Peter.
Because there is actually no evidence that Iran has taken a decision to manufacture nuclear weapons. The leaders of